Well, good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Ann Stewart. I serve as Associate Vice President of Communication here at Princeton Seminary, and I'm so pleased and delighted to welcome you to our library this evening for the latest installment in our public events lecture series. We hope that you're going to mark our next event on your calendars now, as it follows very nicely from this evening's lecture topic. We will be joined in a few weeks by Justin Farrell, who is a Princeton Seminary alum and sociology professor at Yale. He will be here for a book signing and conversation about his newest book entitled The Battle for Yellowstone, Morality and the Sacred Roots of the Environmental Conflict. That will be on April 7th at 7 p.m. here in this room. So we hope to see you again then. We're really pleased to feature these kinds of events in our lecture series this year because as an institution of higher education and of theological learning, it's our firm commitment that the world around us, all of the world, is a context for theological reflection. The Reformed theologian John Calvin said that the earth is a theater of God's glory. And so it is that we as Christians recognize sacred spaces in the world around us, and not only in chapels and churches and halls of learning, but also in fields and forests and oceans. And so that means the environment and even the very soil on which we stand is a context for theological reflection. The Princeton Seminary is working to put this belief into tangible practice. This new library that we're sitting in is a green building, complete with solar panels on the roof and rock gardens that collect rainwater for irrigation. And you'll notice the design of the building. We hope you'll take some time to walk around if you're a visitor here this evening. The design of the building, which features these large windows, is intentionally designed so that as we sit here and study, we always have one eye on the world outdoors. And some of you may know that the seminary's farm is just 3 miles down the road in Lawrence Township and is the home of our Farminary project. So farm plus seminary equals Farminary. It is a place where theological learning happens while members of our community get their hands dirty in the garden. This week is Holy Week. It is a week when Christians reflect on death and resurrection. And you would be surprised what insights the compost pile can share in thinking about decay and new life. The earth is a theater of God's glory. Tonight we have no better guide for this conversation of the environment and theology than Jaqueline Lapsley. Dr. Lapsley is Associate Professor of Old Testament here at Princeton Seminary. She's an alumna of Princeton Seminary and also holds degrees from Smith College, UNC Chapel Hill, and the PhD from Emory University. Dr. Lapsley is the author of Whispering the Word, Hearing Women's Stories in the Old Testament, and Can These Bones Live? The Problem of the Moral Self in the Book of Ezekiel. She's also the editor of the Dictionary of Scripture and Ethics and the Women's Bible Commentary. I think that one of Dr. Lapsley's greatest strengths as both a scholar and a teacher is her ability to create interesting conversations. Conversations between the ancient and the contemporary world, conversations between different scholarly disciplines, and conversations between readers and interpreters of text. She is particularly gifted in asking ethical questions of Scripture and scriptural questions of ethics. That is, her scholarship creates productive tension and conversation that causes us to see the Bible and the moral world in new light. And I'm sure she is going to engage us in that conversation this evening. Her lecture is entitled Down to Earth, the Bible and Environmental Ethics. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jaqueline Lapsley.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that lovely introduction. And it's really a pleasure to be here tonight to talk about the Bible and the environment. These are two things, both of these things, very close to my heart. So, and I look forward to our conversation afterwards. Well, most scholars who talk about the relationship between the Bible and the environment begin by talking about Lynn White. And I'm not going to be an exception to that rule. I'm going to start with Lynn White. Lynn White was a historian of the Middle Ages with a particular focus on the history of science and technology. There he is. He was a lifelong Presbyterian. The son of a Presbyterian minister, he was himself a Presbyterian elder and was buried from his Presbyterian church in 1987 when he died. I will come back to the seemingly incidental fact of Lynn White's Presbyterianism at the end of my talk. In 1966, he gave an address that was later published in the journal Science with the title, "The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis." In that essay, White lays the blame for the modern environmental crisis squarely on, quote, orthodox Christian arrogance toward nature. By orthodox, White means Western Christianity. He describes, this is going to be him now, he describes the creation story in Genesis, and this is what he says. By gradual stages, a loving and all-powerful God had created light and darkness, the heavenly bodies, the earth and all its plants, animals, birds, and fishes. Finally, God had created Adam, and as an afterthought, Eve, to keep man from being lonely. Man named all the animals, thus establishing his dominance over them. God planned all of this explicitly for man's benefit and rule. No item in the physical creation had any purpose save to serve man's purposes. End quote. So White is making two claims there. First, the Bible asserts human domination over nature, establishing a worldview that is anthropocentric, that is, puts humans at the center. And secondly, Christianity makes a distinction between human beings, formed in the image of God, and the rest of creation that has no soul or reason and is thus inferior. Now, since this piece was published, it caused a huge stir. Scholars have been debating, is what Lynn White says true? Does Christianity bear the bulk of the responsibility for our current environmental crisis due to centuries of depredation brought about by industrialization? The answer, I think, is yes and no. So yes, he hit a nerve. The integration of Christianity and industrialization has led to many of our environmental problems. But White also oversimplifies the issue, and there are many scholars who've written about criticizing certain aspects of his argument. Some writers, for example, have argued that White does not take account of the non-Christian influences on Western thought. And Bible scholars have argued that we should be careful to separate out what the Bible actually says about creation, about the world, from the ways that dominant Christianity has interpreted the Bible, which have been destructive for the environment. Now, where Lynn White was correct, and he does a great service in pointing it out so forcefully, is in the way that the most dominant strains of the Judeo-Christian tradition have placed human beings at the center of the cosmos. We do live in an anthropocentric society, and our Christian heritage bears responsibility, some responsibility for it. We view the created world as objects for our exclusive human use. There are too many examples of this attitude to name, and I suspect you all know them as well as I do. But we can just consider the way agribusiness treats animals, not as living creatures, but as objects that can be treated like any inanimate object. Yet the deep irony here is that the scriptures warn against precisely this temptation. the biblical witness is clear that we live actually in a theocentric universe, and our failure to properly situate ourselves vis-a-vis the deity as creatures embedded within creation, that failure to acknowledge that leads to violence, suffering, and oppression. Accordingly, in recent years, biblical scholars and theologians have returned to the biblical witness, seeking to recover that lost perspective. Now, in my talk tonight, I want to do three things. First, I want to explore something of the history of how we got to this point. That'll be a too short history, but it'll give us a sense of the dominant view of creation in the Christian tradition. And then we'll look also at what I call the minority Christian report on creation, the minority view. Secondly, I want to turn to the Bible and to the Old Testament, because that's what I know best, and specifically to the key texts of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and then to a lesser-known text of Psalm 65. Now, my task with the Bible is to try to hear those texts afresh, having set aside the lenses of the dominant Christian ethic. And finally, I will have a look at the relationship between the Reformed theological tradition, which is the theology of the Presbyterian Church, and the link between that and the environmental movement as it developed in the 19th and 20th centuries. And that, if you're coming back for Justin Farrell's talk, will set you up for that conversation. Okay, so thinking about asking the right questions. The philosopher Erzim Kohak stresses that the ecological crisis is attributable to a failure of perception. We see poorly, not perceiving what is good. He says, in order to think the good, we need first to see the good. It is a strategy of contemplation that is required. But how might we perceive the good? And this is where the Bible becomes a resource for us. Now, I admit this is a pretty Presbyterian way of going about things. It was John Calvin who suggested that the Bible's like a pair of glasses that can help us bring God and the world into focus. The Bible fosters right perception, but only if we ask the right questions of it. We need to be wearing the right lenses to read the Bible so that it can form our minds to perceive what is good in the world. By the same logic, it is also clear that asking the wrong questions prevents us from reading Scripture in ways that lead to right perception. Now, not to get too political here, but it has been interesting over the course of the last year to see the dialogue, that's probably not the right word, that Donald Trump has had with the Pope. So the Pope has come out with statements about immigration. And last summer, he issued an encyclical about the environment, as perhaps you're aware, and I'm going to mention that in a moment. In response, Mr. Trump has said that the Pope is too political, as though these issues were not the proper concern of Christianity. Mr. Trump's view is not idiosyncratic, actually, on this point anyway, but reflects widely held understandings that religious belief is unrelated to political issues. Now, very recently, not just in the political sphere, but very recently I had a conversation with a learned person, a former retired professor from an older generation, obviously, who also said that the Pope's weighing in on immigration and the environment is strange, if not inappropriate, because, according to this person, those issues have, quote, nothing to do with Catholic doctrine. So it's a fairly widespread understanding of the relationship between Christianity and the vital issues that face us. For many Christians, the Bible seems to speak authoritatively about personal moral behavior, especially sexual behavior, and encourages us to do charitable acts, and it also tells us how to get to heaven. If we do these things, or even if we don't do them, but we believe the right things, then we will be saved, which is almost always about life after death. Now, curiously, this view is also held by many non-Christians about what the main concerns of the Bible are. In this way of thinking, the most the Bible has to say about the environment is that we should give to the food bank. But the Bible spends a lot more time talking about perceiving ourselves in relation to the world right here than it does about life after death, even. So now I'm going to turn to a little sketch of the domination tradition in Christianity. By that, I mean the relationship, the way the Christian tradition has thought about creation apart from human beings, right? The way I think of it is human beings are embedded in creation. That's the biblical view, but it's not the way we think of ourselves now. We are apart from creation. Richard Bauckham, who's written several books on the Bible and the environment, some of his books are on your bibliography on the back side of the handout. Bauckham offers a general thesis for the overall Christian tradition's take on the environment. He says, the Bible does not teach mastery or exploitative dominion over creation, but historically, the language of the Bible was harnessed in order to legitimate ideas of human dominion which were not themselves biblical in origin or spirit. So let's unpack that history of the exploitative dominion a little bit more. It's actually hard to see the roots of this view within the early sacred writings of Judaism. On the contrary, Judaism was very invested in the nature of humanity's relationship to creation, and especially as regards agriculture. There's an entire section of the Mishnah, the division of agriculture, is devoted to the religious interpretation of Scripture's laws on tithing and the agricultural use of the land. So the situation for early Christianity was very, very different. Because early Christians interpreted the food laws, mainly found in the book of Leviticus, because they interpreted them as no longer pertinent for faith, early Christians produced no writing concerning the positive meaning of the food laws in the Old Testament. One of the central influences on early Christian thought was, of course, Greek philosophy. Now, a certain propensity toward the mastery view was imported from Greek philosophy into Christianity. There were three core convictions of Greek philosophy that made their way into early Christian theology. First, God made creation, the world, for humanity's use, for the purpose of making human life better. Secondly, the world God made is strongly hierarchical. There is a natural order with human beings at the top. And thirdly, humans are in a different category from other animals because of their rationality. And thus, questions of justice do not apply when humans are dealing with the rest of creation. So those three things that came from Greek philosophy into early Christian theology. They're not biblical ideas. That being said, for the most part, early Christian interpreters weren't interested in the relationship between humanity and creation. They simply did not explicitly reflect on this question. And so they did not produce a clear exploitation theology, but neither did they argue against such a reading. They were interested in other questions. So they interpreted the Genesis texts about dominion, which we're going to look at in a minute. They interpreted those texts allegorically. So texts that appear to be about human relations with the earth are actually about human beings' internal dominion over their own passions. So an example from the Garden of Eden here illustrates the allegorical approach. So this is my little translation of Genesis 2:15. God puts the human being in the garden to serve it and preserve it. Now, when ancient Christian interpreters read this passage, many read it allegorically in terms of the human-divine relationship. What does it mean for men to protect the land? One patristic interpreter notes, there were no thieves or travelers or people with bad intentions. Protect it from what? From himself. Do not lose the land by transgressing the commandment, right? So it's all internalized. Thus, the real meaning for these patristic interpreters, these early Christian interpreters, the real meaning of serving and preserving the garden is that individuals need to avoid transgressing God's laws. So the earliest Christian interpreters basically ignored the earth and its inhabitants. They were more interested in the internal life of the soul. Now, early Christian theologians did imagine that the created world was there for human use, but it did not occur to them that the world was there for humanity to radically reshape, as became prevalent in the modern post-Enlightenment view. They assumed, these early Christian interpreters assumed a certain dominion over nature, but they were not motivated to ponder how they might exploit nature more fully. While their worldview may seem anthropocentric, it was so only in a limited way, within a much broader theocentric framework. They believed that nature reflects and exists for the glory of God. The theology of dominion, anthropocentric but largely not aggressive, that characterizes much Christian theology up to the modern period is not the same thing as this aggressive domination of nature that characterizes Western society today. The aggressive, exploitative posture toward the earth comes into being as a result of modern Enlightenment thinking around the 17th century. Many Enlightenment thinkers saw human dominion over the world not as a static thing, like the early Christians, but as an aspiration to conquer endlessly. The early Enlightenment figure, Francis Bacon, and he's going to be my boogeyman here, Francis Bacon, is one who comes most sharply into focus. He's not alone. He's not idiosyncratic in his view. He's representing other views. But you can see, this is a quote from some of his work. He says, "I am come to very truth, leading you, that is humanity, to nature with all her children, to bind her to your service and make her your slave." And he goes on, "To extend the power and dominion of the human race itself over the universe is a work truly divine." So incredibly creepy. Right? I mean, by the you can also hear echoes, right, of other things going on at this time. It's not just nature who is enslaved, right, by divine right. It's peoples, right, all over the world in this time of imperialism and colonialism. Okay, part of the modern turn toward a domination view of nature is due to a change in the way that people were interpreting the Bible. So they were moving away from allegory, and they were moving toward this literal reading of the Bible. It's not actually that literal, but at any rate, that's how they thought of it. In addition, the Protestant reading of dominion held that humanity was called by God to restore nature to its pre-lapsarian state, that is, to how it was before the fall, how they imagined it was, based on Genesis 2 and 3. The wildness of nature, the savagery of wild animals, the infertility of the ground, the existence of noxious entities, even the irregularities of the earth's surface, these were seen as signs of the fall. It was the job of human beings to tame it all, to force the wildness of nature to submit, in order that it might be restored to a pristine state that supposedly existed before Adam and Eve ate the fruit. So to sum up this whirlwind account, while the modern view of creation as something there for human beings to exploit at will is a relatively modern notion, it is true that the roots of this deeply anthropocentric way of seeing the world go back to Greek philosophy as it came into early Christian theology. The Bible itself, however, does not present the kind of aggressive anthropocentrism that comes to characterize the mainstream Christian tradition at the turn toward modernity, at the Enlightenment. Now I'm going to turn to the Minority Report. So though we have this mastery narrative, there is an important minority report within Christianity as well. An early voice in this minority report is that of Basil of Caesarea. Here's Basil. Saint Basil, as he is known, was a major figure in the 4th century Trinitarian debates. These were debates over how the 3 persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, relate to one another. That was a huge argument at the time. Basil argued for the co-equivalence of the Holy Spirit within the Trinity. That's what he's most famous for. Generally overlooked is the fact that he wrote homilies on the first 6 days of creation in Genesis 1. And it's called the Hexameron. It's a whole book of homilies just on the first 6 days of creation, not including human beings who are created on the 6th day. He didn't care about them. He just wanted those first 6 days when everything else was made. So in the homilies, Basil is an astute and keen observer of the natural world. And it's clear he loves the splendid world around him, the details of which reflect for him the God who made it. We have a little quote here. This is regarding the contours of plants. He says, "I want creation to penetrate you, you, the hearer, the reader, with so much admiration that everywhere, wherever you may be, the least plant may bring to you the clear remembrance of the Creator." So there are actually 9 of these sermons on the 6 days, as I said. It fills a whole book and never even gets to human beings. Now, likewise, the theology of the hermits and a certain form of asceticism saw a much more integrated and harmonious relationship between humanity and nature. St. Francis of Assisi is, of course, the exemplar here, but he represents other voices as well. Here a little picture of St. Francis. He's often pictured with birds, but if you go and Google St. Francis, you will find pictures of him with pretty much every animal imaginable. So I give you here Francis with dogs. Okay. And then I think, in all fairness, Francis with cats. Okay. Now, it seems appropriate in this context to give Pope Francis a shout out. In his encyclical on the environment, Laudato Si, published last summer, Pope Francis draws on the minority report within Christianity. And this is why he took the name Francis, right? Pope Francis picks up quite explicitly on Francis of Assisi's way of thinking in advocating a pro-environment, pro-creation agenda. It should be said that Pope Francis is not simply pushing for particular policies. Rather, he is urging very explicitly that we see differently. Which goes back to what I said towards the beginning. What we need to do is change the way we perceive the world, not just push for this particular policy or this law or that one. So it's a strategy of contemplation that leads to action. There's a picture of the encyclical. So in the encyclical, Pope Francis highlights the connection between the environmental crisis and poverty. The fact that environmental degradation and climate change affect the poor disproportionately, though wealthier countries are the primary producers of climate change. So Pope Francis channels the Bible and Basil of Caesarea and Francis of Assisi into a sacramental view of creation. The Pope understands that changing the way we perceive and so the way we feel is very much about changing the way we feel. That's crucial. So I want to give a quote from him because it's right on this point. He says, this is from the encyclical, the response of Francis of Assisi to the world around him was so much more than intellectual appreciation or economic calculus. For to him, each and every creature was a sister, united to him by bonds of affection. That is why he felt called to care for all that exists, Such a conviction cannot be written off as naive romanticism, for it affects the choices which determine our behavior. If we approach nature and the environment without this openness to awe and wonder, if we no longer speak the language of fraternity and beauty in our relationship with the world, our attitude will be that of masters, ruthless exploiters, unable to set limits on our immediate needs. By contrast, if we feel intimately united with all that exists, then sobriety and care will well up spontaneously. The poverty and austerity of St. Francis were no mere veneer of asceticism, but something much more radical, a refusal to turn reality into an object simply to be used and controlled. End quote. So to summarize this little foray into this, the whole of Christianity's views of creation, we can see that the problem of seeing the world as full of resources to be exploited is not a biblical idea, but one whose roots can be traced to other sources. So then, what does the Bible say about our relationship to creation? There have been a number of biblical scholars who have taken this question up in the last 10 to 15 years, and a number of them are listed on your bibliography on the back. Those are all books I recommend. So what I want to do here is just look at a couple of key texts as examples of the way the Bible can become a pair of spectacles through which we may see the world differently. So the first text I want to look at is Genesis 1, famous text, and specifically Genesis 1, verse 26. Now this is a verse that has caused a lot of mischief because it has been a proof text for the exploitation interpretation. What is this dominion to look like there in let them have dominion over the fish of the seas? Well, ask pretty much any Old Testament scholar, and the first thing they will tell you is that the ancient Near Eastern context in which this text was written is important for understanding it. The kind of domination, in the ancient Near East, a king or a queen is supposed to do justice and protect the weak against exploitation. That is the expectation of monarchs. So here, the kind of dominion that human beings are to have over creation is envisioned like the relationship between a sovereign and the people. It is not a despotic view of dominion, but a protective one. Because human beings are made in the image and likeness of God, human beings are to rule as God rules, as those who protect, not exploit. Bill Brown, in his book, The Ethos of the Cosmos, puts it this way: the command to subdue and have dominion over the world is freighted with qualification. It is a mandate of stewardship, not exploitation. It is the blessing of gentle, life-giving dominion consonant with the Creator's way. End quote. So Ellen Davis, another Old Testament scholar, gives us a different translation based on the translation of one little Hebrew preposition. I know some of my students are here, so this is your moment to feel like I know some Hebrew and now it's coming to be useful. Okay, so instead of dominion over, Ellen Davis suggests it's mastery among. That they may exercise skilled mastery among the fish of the sea. And this means that human beings have the expertise and the ability to use that expertise for the benefit of all, both humans and other creatures living on the earth. So reading the text as a whole, we see that violence and exploitation are explicitly excluded from the creation. Ellen Davis connects these verses to the verses that follow in 29 and 30. So I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps in the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food. So Davis links God's gift of food to everything that lives, animals and human beings. She links this to the preceding command to human beings to have dominion. She argues that the most essential activity befitting humans created in the image of God is to secure the food system that God gives to sustain all creatures. That is our primary vocation. She thinks it's no accident that the first violation in chapter 3, right, Adam and Eve in chapter 3 in the garden, when the human couple take the fruit, that first violation is an eating violation. The first 3 chapters of the Bible feature food very prominently. Maybe how we eat is part of original sin. Okay, I'm going to turn now briefly to Genesis 2, the second creation story, and I want to zero in on the creation of the human being there. So, the word I've translated as serve here, no, I haven't gotten there yet. I did get there at the bottom. The word I've translated as serve is a Hebrew verb in verse 15 at the bottom. Is a Hebrew word that means, it means to serve. It is, I'm translating it extremely literally. It can also mean to worship. It almost always gets translated in the translations in English, NRSV, and others as to till, right? Which is something you can only really do with the ground. So serve is really a suitable translation. Ellen Davis suggests, this is her translation, to work and serve the ground, to preserve and observe it. So the purpose of the human being here, human beings are created to serve the ground, not the other way around. Genesis 2 shows us God making a garden, and then God makes a human being to take care of the garden. Before we leave Genesis 2, John Calvin's interpretation of verse 15 is worth noting. Now, as we would expect, Calvin first reads the verse as a caution against idleness, right? That's very Calvinist of him. Calvinist before Calvinism. He says, now Moses adds that the earth was given to many with this condition, that he should occupy himself in cultivation, whence it follows that men were created to employ themselves in some work and not to lie down in inactivity and idleness, right? That's very Calvin. But then he goes on. Moses adds that the custody of the garden was given in charge to Adam to show that we possess the things which God has committed to our hands on the condition that being content with a frugal and moderate use of them, we should take care of all that remains. Let him who possesses a field so partake of its yearly fruits that he may not suffer the ground to be injured by his negligence. But let him endeavor to hand it down to posterity as he received it, or even better cultivated. Let everyone regard himself as the steward of God in all things which he possesses. Then he will neither conduct himself dissolutely nor corrupt by abuse those things which God requires to be preserved. So if we actually heeded Calvin, who's not exactly known for being out on the environmental fringe, if we actually heeded Calvin, we would be much better off today than we are. Now I want to take a brief look at Psalm 65, which is a lesser known text than Genesis 2, but it's one in which God is also imaged as a farmer. God in Genesis 2 is a farmer, and God in Psalm 65 is also a farmer. Now you have that on your handout. It's not the whole psalm, it's part of the psalm there. And I just want to point out a few things about it. The imagery in verse 9 is of the rain God provides that makes it possible for grain to grow. And then verse 10 pauses on the image of the water making its way across the earth. You, O God, water its furrows abundantly, settling its ridges, softening it with showers. And then the summary statement at the end of verse 10, the earth's growth you bless, O God. And I want to emphasize the word growth here. So we live in a consumer society, consuming consumer society, that focuses on the products, not the process of growing things, to the point now where we have children who don't know that food actually grows, right, in the earth. But Psalm 65 is a meditation on the process of growing, with God as the farmer, who tends to the creation as a farmer cares for the earth she has sown. In verses 12 and 13, we see the earth offering its praise to God, clothing itself in joy simply at being part of God's abundance. Here we see it in the hills, the meadows, the valleys, who wear their bounty like a splendid outfit. The psalm opens in verse 1, you don't have this part, but the psalm opens in verse 1 by saying, "To you, O God, silence is praise." Now, Ellen Davis notes in light of this silence is praise that human beings would do well to be quiet more often. She says of this psalm, God's praise does not come from human lips, but rather from the fruitful earth itself. The psalmist is challenging us to hear what we cannot hear, deafened as we are by our own constant noise. Calling for an end to all that noise, this verbal icon, that's the psalm, this verbal icon reveals to us the great harmonious hymn of all the creatures, the silent praise they give to God. End quote. So in Psalm 65, God is a farmer, and a farmer who perceives the whole beautiful world as a place of growth for everything that grows within it, including us. If we use Scripture as a lens for seeing this world, we will begin to perceive it as beautiful, as God does. We will see God the farmer at work and will grow in love along with the rest of creation. Now, I want to end, it's a little bit of a leap, but I hope you'll see some connections. I want to end by considering how the Reformed tradition, which is the theological tradition behind both Congregationalists and Presbyterians, how the Reformed tradition has influenced the environmental movement in the last 2 centuries. And here I'm drawing from a book by Mark Stoll, Inherit the Holy Mountain, and it's on your bibliography. So Stoll looked at the religious upbringings of the major figures in the environmental movement from the 19th century through the 20th century. And he found, and he was very surprised by this, that a highly disproportionate number of them, of these major figures in the environmental movement, had grown up in the Reformed tradition, that is, as Congregationalists or Presbyterians. In the early to mid part of the 19th century, it was the Congregationalists. And I quote Stoll here, virtually every single person associated with the early movements for parks and forest conservation was no further than 1 generation away from a Congregational church in a small New England town. So I want to give you a few examples of some of these figures and then reflect a little bit on what might be going on there. So the first figure is Frederick Law Olmsted. So Olmsted was raised Congregationalist and was deeply committed to conservation of public green space. Of course, he's most famous for having designed Central Park in New York City and also Cadwallader Park in Trenton, a little closer to home. He was, and probably still is, the nation's greatest and most influential landscape architect. By the latter part of the 19th century and into the 20th century, Congregationalists had kind of disappeared from the environmental advocacy scene, only to be replaced almost entirely by Presbyterians. So a prominent example from this period is John Muir, you probably recognize, who campaigned to preserve what is now Yosemite National Park and other wilderness areas. And he was the founder of the Sierra Club. And that's the California Quarter that they issued in honor of John Muir in 2004. So beginning with Muir, Presbyterians became a dominant force, especially in federal positions promoting conservation. The progressive era between 1885 and 1921 or so was the best period for environmentalism in American history. The National Park Service and the U.S. Forestry Service were created at this time, for example. Gifford Pinchot, there he is, who had a maternal lineage of Puritans and Huguenots through his mother's line, was largely responsible for the founding of the U.S. Forest Service in 1905, together with President Teddy Roosevelt, also a Presbyterian. Now, Pinchot, this is a little side note, but Pinchot was a rather eccentric figure. He was very powerful in actually able to conserve vast swaths of land in the West, but he was a bit eccentric. His fiancée had died when they were both quite young. I think she was 22 or 23. And he then, for decades afterwards, communicated with her spirit. And he wrote about it in his journal and said what the dialogues were and so forth, and did not marry until very late in life when he felt that she was no longer communicating with him. By the way, a little plug for one of the books on your bibliography is called The Big Burn by Timothy Egan. Timothy Egan is a columnist for the New York Times, and he wrote this book about kind of the birth of the U.S. Forestry Service, and Gifford Pinchot figures very prominently in it. It's a page turner. It is like not, it's a, what do I want to say? It's a really fun book and tells a really great story, very compelling story. Okay. Okay, the years between about 1885 and 1921 were the progressive era, that's what it's always called, but it's really the progressive Presbyterian era when it comes to environmental conservation. Presbyterians held the White House for 28 out of those 36 years, and the Department of the Interior was headed by Presbyterians for 43 out of 57 years between 1889 and 1946. Stoll says progressive conservationists were nearly all raised Presbyterian. The dominance of Presbyterians in the environmental movement more generally lasted through the mid-20th century, well into the 1960s, and then it abruptly stopped. And they were succeeded in the environmental movement in terms of religious affiliation by African American Baptists, Catholics, and Jews. So, but the last raised Presbyterian that I want to lift up is Rachel Carson. So Rachel Carson, who was famous for having written Silent Spring in 1962, which gave a huge jolt, of course, to the most recent episode in the environmental movement. She was she died very shortly after she published the book. Now, by Mark Stoll's account, Rachel's mother, who was the daughter of a Presbyterian minister, would conduct nature studies with Rachel in her backyard. She went on to be a scientist. And the mother was, quote, dour, stern, devout, and always dressed in black. But she was the one who taught her daughter to love nature. So what is it then about Reformed theology that formed and informed these and many other early environmentalists? Well, here are a few core values of Reformed theology that might lead one to engage with environmental issues in the public realm. First of all, the emphasis on the sovereignty of God counters anthropocentrism. The conviction of the total depravity of human beings, which often kind of gets tossed around as a joke, but really that deep-seated sinfulness, which is a conviction of Reformed theology, fosters the urge to see public policy curb human sinfulness. In the case of the environment, it is greed that stands out as the greatest sin. Next, the emphasis on covenant life, on the common good, counters American individualism. So that is to say, life is lived together in community. That's how we're in relation to God, not so much just the individual. Next, the exhortation to stewardship that, quote, shuns ostentation, right? And we go back to Calvin with this, points toward the faithful living a frugal life. And the belief that God's people are called to service and to work for the transformation of society. Again, an emphasis on the public good. Encourages active engagement in public life. Now, why, you may be wondering, have I trotted out these Presbyterians and Congregationalists who were so important in the environmental movement? Is it because Princeton Theological Seminary is a Presbyterian seminary and I want to, hearken back to the glory days of Presbyterianism? No. One fact I have held back in my presentation. The vast majority of these environmentalists raised on Reformed theology left the church at some point in their adult life. Now, Stoll in his book puzzles over this fact. What is the connection between being a lapsed Presbyterian and an environmentalist? So I want to suggest that this is kind of a hypothesis that I've come to thinking about these issues. Growing up on Reformed theology gives one a way of seeing the world that encourages care for creation and the motivation to act in the public sphere for the common good. It's very interesting. Stoll shows how the Congregationalists were very active in the environmental movement and sort of fostering environmental understanding, but they weren't involved in legislation, in policy, in government, in that kind of action. It was the Presbyterians who were all about that, making it policy. So I want to conclude, I want to say one other thing about that. It stirs one, that is the Reformed theology, stirs one to see God in the beauty of creation and the belief that only public policy will protect that beauty. But as these young people grew into adulthood, perhaps they also saw that the church was not really living by its convictions, that the actions and inactions of the church were in conflict with its core values. So they took those core values they had learned and went out into the world, into government, determined to fight on behalf of God's beautiful world. But they left the church behind because its actions were not congruent with its inherent values. So I want to conclude just by returning to the question of how we perceive the world. The environmental scientist and activist Gus Speth says he used to think that environmental problems could be solved by science. But then he realized that, quote, top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. And we scientists don't know how to do that. What is needed is a way of seeing the world. And I have suggested that reading the Bible with new lenses is one way of seeing God's world anew. I'll conclude just by sharing this picture. Stoll actually begins his account, his whole book, with painters who were reared on Reformed theology, who shaped American landscape painting in the early 19th century. And he connects those painters to the beginnings of the environmental movement. Early American landscape paintings endow the landscape with a moral quality. Nature embodies God's glory for these painters. Why does he begin with the painters? It's not surprising in a way, because as we have seen addressing these challenges, it's not about piecemeal technological fixes or even particular policy decisions. It's about seeing and perceiving the world, perception. So right policy decisions will follow from right vision. Thank you.